Hi, I'm Ron Kneebone, and this is the School of Public Policy. Homelessness is a very complex social problem. If you fall into homelessness, it's because not so much of your own choice, certainly it's never of your own choice. People don't fall into homelessness out of choice. They fall into homelessness because of their circumstances. There may be mental health challenges, there may be addictions, but those are relatively small explanations for the number of people using shelters. Most people using shelters are using them because they're poor. And they're poor because their income is low relative to the cost of housing. They're also falling into shelters because their poverty is such that their income is uncertain. So their income's low, but it also occasionally disappears on them because they've been laid off for reasons such as that. Or they get an especially large utility bill, or food prices go up, so making it difficult to both feed yourself and house yourself. The choice then is to feed yourself and use a shelter. This is a very complex problem. The focus of this study is to look at who it is that's using emergency homeless shelters across Canada. We looked at data from 51 cities from across Canada, and we asked a fairly simple question. In each of those 51 cities, why did those cities provide emergency shelter beds? And the explanations we looked at included things like it's cold in that city. The colder it is, the more likely social agencies in the city will provide shelter beds to protect people from freezing to death in a cold Canadian winter. The other thing we looked at is the number of people in that community who might suffer housing discrimination. And I'm talking about an Aboriginal population. I'm also talking about recent international migrants. These are people that researchers have shown suffer housing discrimination. And if that population is large, homeless shelter operators may need to provide more beds than they would otherwise. But our key ingredient is the cost of housing relative to people's incomes. In cities where rents are high and social assistance incomes are low, shelter providers have found it necessary to provide more shelter beds. Our study shows that we can address that problem in a number of ways. Policymakers have a lot of policy levers at their disposal. They can, for example, increase the income paid to people on social assistance. We show that a fairly modest increase of social assistance incomes would enable emergency shelter operators to close 20% of their beds. That's a remarkably strong response. And it comes from the fact that what we're doing is giving people a sufficient income to stay in their homes. Other things that governments can do is to provide rent subsidies, and by doing so, reduce rents. There are also a plethora of other things that cities can do, that city governments can do, and provinces can do, and the federal government can do. They can do things like changing zoning laws to make it cheaper for builders to build low-end housing. They could deregulate the housing sector a little bit to, again, reduce the cost of providing housing. Studies in the United States show that efforts at densification increase, in particular, the cost of low-end housing. So these are things that governments could stop doing. So a real driver of homeless use, and it's increased quite a lot over the last 10, 20 years, is because Canada's changing. The number of rich people has grown and the number of poor people has also grown. There's been a separation of the two. And increasingly cities, particularly Calgary is a good example, have become cities designed and built for relatively wealthy people. And being left behind are the relatively poor people. And the city is not designed for them anymore. The governments in cities like Calgary have closed trailer parks, which is where people used to live when they were poor. They have closed single-room occupancy hotels, which is where poor people used to live. So there should be no surprise that in a wealthy city, when they respond to their wealth in these sorts of ways, that people go into homeless shelters. It's because we've closed the housing, we've torn down the housing in which they used to live, and now they've had to go into homeless shelters. If I were to make suggestions to policymakers, and of course I am, I would suggest to them that there's a lot of things that they can do. They have a lot of tools at their disposal. An important thing to recognize is that the homeless problem differs by city. And so there is no cookie cutter solution that would work in every city. Every city has to look at their homeless problem and understand where it's coming from and therefore what the policy solution would be. But there are some broad things that I could talk about. All governments could play a role at reducing poverty. And reducing poverty is a very effective way at attacking the homelessness problem. All governments could undertake more policies to encourage the private sector to build more affordable housing. Having the government build affordable housing is dreadfully expensive. It's far cheaper to encourage the private sector to build low-end housing through tax incentives and housing tax credits and other ways like that in order to encourage the private sector to fill this need. There's a lot of things that governments can do. All levels of government need to be part of this solution. You can find this report online at the School of Public Policy website at policyschool.ca/publications. I'm Ron Kneebone. Thanks again for watching.